September 1879. The sun was dying over the Sierra Nevada horizon when Elena Vidal crossed the pine forest with bare, bleeding feet. Her wedding dress, now a tattered ghost of what it once was, caught on low branches as she ran like a wounded deer. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. The dry evening air burned her throat. Each breath was a reminder that she was still alive, that she had escaped. Her father's words echoed like poisoned daggers. The Barrios' fortune will save. Curse from ruin. And then Mateo Barrios, the banker's son, a man of nearly 40 with eyes like stone, whispering before the guests, "I'll tame her like a wild mare." Elena clutched the silver brooch shaped like a poppy that had belonged to her mother. It was the only thing she had managed to take with her, the only possession that truly belonged to her in a world where she herself was considered property. Twilight gave way to night when her legs finally gave out. Her dress weighed heavily, soaked with sweat and blood from scratches. She fell to her knees beside a stream that meandered among moss-covered rocks. The water reflected her face, green eyes wild with fear, cheeks marked by dried tears, brown hair that had lost all its pins during the escape. "Follow the water," she remembered the words of the old shepherd who used to tell stories in the village square. Water always leads to some place where people settle. With what strength she had left, Elena followed the course of the stream. The new moon barely illuminated her path, turning trees into threatening silhouettes. Her feet, accustomed to the polished floors of the family home, now bled on stones and pine needles. But the physical pain was insignificant, compared to the agony she had felt seeing her future sealed by a ring that weighed like a shackle. When she spotted the faint glow of a lamp among the trees, her heart skipped a beat. A small log cabin stood, in a clearing with smoke rising from the chimney. Elena stopped, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. Who would live there? Would they turn her over to her father if they found her? The decision was made for her when her legs finally gave way completely. She fell to the ground with a stifled groan, her consciousness fading like the last light of day. The last thing she saw was a figure emerging from the cabin, tall and silent as the pines surrounding them. The smell of freshly made coffee was the first thing Elena perceived as she regained consciousness. A wooden ceiling replaced the starry sky, and the warmth of a rough blanket had replaced the cold of the night. Her feet, once bloody, were now clean and bandaged with strips of cotton. She slowly sat up, every muscle protesting from the effort of her escape. The cabin was small but orderly, a table with 2 rough chairs, an iron stove, shelves with jars of dried herbs and preserves, cured hides, and a rifle hung on the wall. There were no ornaments, no portraits, nothing that spoke of who lived there. "You've slept for almost an entire day." The deep voice startled her. A man stood by the door as if he had been about to leave, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by the sun and a dark beard flecked with grey. His eyes the colour of amber observed her with a mixture of caution and something she couldn't identify. It wasn't pity, it was recognition, as if he saw a reflection of himself in her. "Thank you for—" Elena's voice came out as a rough whisper, "for healing me." The man nodded once and approached to offer her a cup of coffee. His movements were precise, measured, like someone accustomed to not wasting energy. "I'm Adrian Montero," he said simply, without demanding her name in return. Elena hesitated, holding the cup between her hands to absorb its warmth. The Vidal name was known throughout the region. If this man recognized her, "My name is Elena," she finally responded, omitting her surname. Adrian looked at her for a moment as if weighing the truth in her words, but didn't ask anything more. He moved away toward the stove where he stirred something in a pot. "Aren't you going to ask why I was running through the forest in a wedding dress?" she asked, disconcerted by his lack of curiosity. He turned, serving her a bowl of stew that smelled of wild herbs and rabbit. "Whatever you've left behind is your business," he answered in a calm voice. "What you do next is also yours. While you're here, all that matters is that you're safe." Elena felt something unraveling in her chest, a tension she had carried for so long that it had become part of her. "Can I stay?" The words escaped her lips before she could contain them. Adrian looked out the window, toward the forest stretching endlessly beneath the morning light. "Winter approaches," he said as his only response. It would be dangerous for you to continue your journey now, at least until your feet heal. It was then that Eleanor noticed the scars on Adrian's hands that had cleaned her wounds without asking who she was or what she was fleeing from. Hands that knew pain but still knew how to be gentle. That night, lying on the cot that Adrian had given up for her while he slept by the fire, Elena listened to the sounds of the forest through the wooden walls. They weren't the refined noises of her father's house, with servants moving silently in measured conversations. It was the primitive language of a world that didn't demand appearances. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to breathe without feeling like she was drowning. The days slipped by like the waters of the stream, one after another, unhurried. Eleanor discovered that Adrian lived by hunting, from a small garden, and occasionally went down to the village to trade furs for provisions. He was a man of few words who seemed to communicate better with gestures and silences. A week after her arrival, when her feet had healed enough, Eleanor found herself watching him as he skinned a rabbit. His hands moved with precision, not wasting. A single movement. "Teach me," she asked, surprising herself. Adrian looked up, his amber eyes studying her with curiosity. "Are you sure? It's not work for hands that have never known effort." Elena looked at her own hands, white with long fingers, educated to play the piano and embroider tablecloths she would never use. Hands that had never created anything truly useful. "That's precisely why," she responded firmly. "If I stay here, I must learn to survive on my own." Something like approval crossed Adrian's face. He nodded once and motioned for her to come closer. He showed her how to hold the knife, how to separate the skin without damaging the meat. Her hands were stained with blood, and the metallic smell turned her stomach, but she didn't pull away. There was something liberating about this primitive act, in this direct connection to survival that had been denied to her in her previous life. "Why do you live alone here?" Eleanor asked as they washed the knives in the stream. The cold water reddened her knuckles, washing away the last traces of blood. Adrian contemplated the forest before answering, as if searching for words in the pine. "Tops, there's a silence here that isn't found in other places," he finally said. "A silence that allows you to hear what truly matters." He added nothing more. But Eleanor sensed that there was a story behind this response, a wound that was perhaps similar to her own. During the following days, Adrian taught her to recognize medicinal herbs, to track in the forest, to light a fire, with flint. Eleanor learned to ride a horse like men do, with legs astride the saddle, feeling the animal's movement as an extension of her own body. He taught her to shoot with the old rifle, how to breathe before pulling the trigger, how to feel the recoil without fearing it. One afternoon, after returning from checking the traps, they found boot prints around the cabin. Someone had been there during their absence. Adrian examined the marks in silence, his face impenetrable. "They might be looking for you," he finally said, without accusation in his voice. Elena felt fear, that old acquaintance, returning to her chest. "If you want me to leave..." Adrian looked at her then, and for the first time Elena saw something fierce in his eyes. "As long as I breathe, no one will take you from here against your will." That night, Elena took out the poppy brooch she had hidden in the hem of her torn dress. She contemplated it in the firelight, its silver petals glowing with a reddish gleam. "It was my mother's," she explained, feeling Adrian's gaze upon her. "She died when I was 12. My father changed after that. He became cold, obsessed, with appearances and social position." Adrian nodded, as if he perfectly understood what she wasn't saying. "Sometimes, all we have left of those we love are objects," he said, in a voice that seemed to come from far away. "But what truly matters is what we build with what they taught us." Elena closed her fingers around the brooch, feeling its familiar weight, but now with a new meaning. It was no longer just a memory of what was lost, but a reminder of what she could build. October brought cold winds that announced winter. The trees began to undress, covering the ground with a crunching carpet of golden and copper leaves. Elena had learned to move through the forest almost as smoothly as Adrian recognized, eyeing paths invisible to inexperienced eyes, identifying sounds that presaged danger. One morning, while collecting wild berries for winter preserves, the neighing of horses alerted her. She instinctively crouched, hiding among the bushes. 2. Riders were approaching the cabin along the main path. She recognized the uniforms of the rural guard, men who often did work for influential families in the region, for families like the Vidals, like the Barrios. With her heart beating wildly, Elena slipped between the trees until she reached the back of the cabin. Adrian was already there, rifle in hand, his posture tense but controlled. "Stay inside," he told her in a low voice. "Don't come out until I tell you." Elena nodded, but before entering, her eyes met Adrian's. Without words, she conveyed her fear, her gratitude, her trust. He held her gaze for an instant, and then nodded once, a gesture that contained a promise. From inside the cabin, Elena heard the men's voices muffled by the wooden walls. "We're looking for a woman," one of them said. "Elena Vidal. She disappeared on her wedding day almost a month ago. Her father is offering a reward." "I haven't seen anyone," Adrian responded, his voice calm but firm. "I live alone." "They've reported smoke from this cabin more frequently than usual," the other rider insisted, "and we found this near the stream." Elena held her breath. What could they have found? Some possession she had dropped during her escape? "Winter is coming," Adrian responded naturally. "I need more firewood and stored food. As for what you've found, many people pass through these forests." There was a tense silence, and Elena approached the window, slightly parting the curtain to see. The rural guards remained mounted, while Adrian confronted them from the porch, his posture seemingly relaxed, but Elena knew he could reach the rifle in an instant if necessary. "If you see her," the older guard finally said, "let her father." "No, Miss Vidal is not in her right mind. She fled from a match advantageous to her entire family." "I'll keep that in mind," Adrian responded, his voice neutral. "Safe journey back." The riders slowly moved away, casting suspicious glances toward the cabin. Elena waited until the sound of hooves disappeared before going out. Adrian was still standing on the porch observing the empty path. "They're searching for you with persistence," he said, without turning. "They won't give up easily." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold wind. "I know. My father has never accepted no for an answer, and Mateo Barrios," her voice broke, remembering the cold eyes of the man to whom they had forced her to be engaged. "He sees people as possessions, things that can be bought." Adrian turned then, and his amber eyes seemed darker under the dim light of the evening. "You should continue your journey when the weather improves," he said, though something in his voice contradicted his words. "Go further north where they don't." "Know you?" Elena felt the ground moving beneath her feet. The idea of leaving the cabin, of moving away from Adrian, produced a void in her chest that she hadn't anticipated. "Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Adrian held her gaze, and for an instant, the mask of impassivity seemed to crack. "What I want doesn't matter," he finally responded. "It's about your safety." That night, as the wind shook the bare branches of the trees, Elena remained awake on her cot, listening to Adrian's steady breathing from his place by the fire. In barely a month, this silent man, this wild forest, had become her refuge. The idea of losing them seemed unbearable, but she knew Adrian was right. As long as she stayed there, both would be in danger. Her father wouldn't stop until he found her, and Mateo Barrios wouldn't tolerate having what he considered his taken away. With a heavy heart, Elena made a decision. She would leave at dawn, without goodbyes. It was best for both of them. The cold bit her cheeks when Elena left the cabin, wrapped in an old wool coat she had found in a trunk. Dawn was just beginning to tint the horizon with pale hues. She carried with her the little she could consider her own, the poppy brooch, a knife that Adrian had taught her to use, and provisions for a few days. Her feet, now hardened after weeks of walking through the forest, barely felt the stones on the path. She stopped by the stream where it had all begun and looked back. The cabin remained silent, with a thin thread of smoke coming from the chimney. "Were you going to leave without saying goodbye?" Adrian's voice startled her. He was standing, a few meters away, like a natural extension of the forest. How long had he been following her? How had she not heard him? "It's better this way," Elena responded, her voice broken by contained emotion. "I've put you in danger. If my father discovers..." "You've been hiding me?" I decide what risks I take, Adrian interrupted, approaching slowly. Not you. The dawn light now illuminated his face, revealing lines Elena hadn't noticed before, old scars that spoke of battles she didn't know. I don't want to be a burden to you, she admitted, lowering her gaze. Is that what you think you are? Adrian asked with unusual softness in his voice. A burden? Elena looked up, disconcerted by the question. Since I arrived, I've only brought you problems. The guards, the danger. Before you came, he interrupted. This cabin was just a place where I slept. Now, he paused as if searching for the right words. Now it's different. The silence between them was filled with the murmur of the stream and the song of the first birds. Don't go, Adrian finally said, and there was something in his voice that Elena had never heard before, a vulnerability that contradicted all his exterior strength. Stay. At least until you're sure where you want to go. Elena felt something expanding in her chest, a warmth that countered the morning cold. What if I decide to stay longer? She asked with a thread of a voice. Adrian looked at her, then really looked at her, as if trying to memorize every detail of her face. Then this cabin will be your home for as long as you wish. Elena let her small bundle of provisions fall. She didn't need to go north. She didn't need to flee further. The refuge she sought wasn't a place, it was a person. It was this man who had taught her that strength wasn't in dominating but in protecting. I'm staying, she said simply. Adrian nodded once, and together they returned to the cabin as the sun rose among the pines, pouring golden light on the path they now walked together. November arrived with the first snowfall, transforming the forest into a landscape of white silence. Adrian's cabin, once a temporary refuge for Elena, had become a home. Together they had prepared preserves, smoked meat, gathered enough firewood to withstand the harshest months. Elena discovered that her hands, once dedicated only to tasks considered appropriate for a young lady, now knew how to cure hides, mend worn clothes, and prepare medicines with the herbs Adrian had taught her to identify. One afternoon, while Elena was mending by the fire, Adrian entered with a worn wooden box. He placed it on the table with a care that revealed its importance. I found this when I was checking the shed, he said, opening the lid. Inside was an old violin with loose strings and cracked varnish, but still beautiful in its form. Do you play? Elena asked, approaching with curiosity. Adrian shook his head. It was my brother's, he replied, with a shadow crossing his gaze. He died long ago. I thought perhaps you... Elena took the instrument with reverence. Her fingers remembered the lessons of her childhood, when music was a refuge and not a social obligation. It needs repair, she observed, gently passing her fingers over the wood. But it could sound again. Adrian nodded, and in that silent gesture, Elena read more than he would ever say with words. He was offering her a part of his past, a trust she knew he didn't easily grant. During the long winter nights, as snow accumulated against the windows and the wind howled among the trees, Elena worked on the violin. She strung new strings, polished. The wood adjusted the pegs. Adrian sometimes watched her, sitting in silence by the fire, carving figures in pieces of wood with his knife. What was your brother like? Elena asked one night while tuning the violin. Adrian stopped carving, his gaze lost in the flames. Javier was light, he responded after a long silence. Where I saw obstacles, he saw paths. Where I kept silence, he found the right words. What happened to him? Elena asked softly. Adrian breathed deeply before answering. The war. He enlisted, believing in ideals that turned out to be lies. He came back changed. One night he simply went into the forest with his rifle. His voice broke. I found him 3 days later. Elena put down the violin and approached Adrian. Without words, she took his rough hand in hers. She offered no empty consolation or unnecessary questions, just her presence, her warmth, her understanding. Sometimes I still hear him, Adrian confessed, his gaze fixed on their joined hands. His violin, on very silent nights. Elena squeezed his hand more tightly. Then we must make it sound again, I said with determination, so you can hear him better. On Christmas night, with the cabin illuminated by candles and the aroma of freshly baked bread floating in the air, Elena took the repaired violin. The first notes, trembling, rose in the silence. It was an ancient melody, a lullaby her mother had taught her. She watched as Adrian closed his eyes, his usually severe face softening with each note. When she finished playing, a silence filled with emotion filled the room. "Thank you," he said, simply, but Elena understood all that he didn't say. That night, as snow silently fell on the forest, something changed between them. An invisible wall had crumbled, allowing light to enter places that had remained in shadows for too long. January was advancing with its mantle of ice and silence when Elena found the book. It was hidden under a loose board near the fireplace, wrapped in a piece of worn leather. A diary, with yellowed pages filled with tight but elegant handwriting. She opened it with curiosity, knowing it belonged to Adrian, aware that she was invading his privacy, but unable to resist. The first pages dated from 5 years ago when Adrian had arrived in these forests. "I've built the cabin where Javier and I used to camp," said one entry. "Here, perhaps I can hear his voice in the wind. Here, perhaps I can forgive myself for not having saved him." Elena closed the book, overwhelmed by the intimacy of those words. She now understood why Adrian had chosen this isolation, why he preferred the silence of the forests to human voices. It wasn't just a refuge for him, it was a penance. When Adrian returned from checking the traps, Elena had returned the diary to its hiding place, but something in her expression must have betrayed her, because he looked at her intently. "You found it," he said, not as an accusation but as a statement. Elena nodded, unable to lie. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" "It doesn't matter," he interrupted, taking off his snow-covered jacket. "There are no secrets worth keeping." That night, as they shared a dinner of rabbit stew, Adrian spoke more than he ever had. He told her about his childhood with Javier, about how both had been orphaned young, about how they had taken care of each other. He told her about the guilt that consumed him for not having seen the signs, for not having prevented his brother from taking his own life. "I came here to die. Slowly," he confessed, his gaze fixed on his plate, "to disappear from the world that had taken everything from me." Elena extended her hand across the table, touching Adrian's. "But you didn't die," she said softly. "You're still here. You're still creating life with your hands. The garden, the animals, this cabin." Adrian looked up and his amber eyes shone with contained emotion. "Since you arrived," he said in a husky voice, "I've begun to wonder if there are more reasons to keep living than I believed." Those words settled between them like snowflakes, delicate but transformative. Elena felt something blossoming in her chest, a feeling she had tried to deny, but that grew with each shared day. February brought more intense storms that completely isolated the cabin. For entire days, they could do nothing but stay by the fire, rationing provisions, telling each other stories to fill the silence imposed by nature. Elena began to notice subtle changes in Adrian. The way his eyes followed her when she moved around the cabin, how his fingers lingered a second longer than necessary when he passed her a plate or a cup, the softness that settled in his gaze when he thought she wasn't watching him. One night, as the storm lashed with particular fury at the walls of the cabin, Elena played the violin by the fire, an improvised melody that spoke of longings and silences. When she finished, Adrian was standing beside her, so close she could feel the heat emanating from his body. "Elena," he said, with a voice softer than she had ever heard from him, "there's something I must ask you." She put the violin aside, her heart beating strongly. Adrian breathed deeply as if gathering strength. "When spring comes and the roads open again, will you stay?" The question floated between them, loaded with unexpressed meanings. It wasn't just about remaining in the cabin. It was about them, about what they had begun to build together. Elena stood up facing him, so close she could distinguish the golden flecks in his amber eyes. "What if I told you I never want to leave?" she responded, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. Adrian raised a hand, hesitating an instant before gently brushing Elena's cheek. "Then I would say that this cabin has been a home since you crossed its door." Elena closed her eyes, leaning into the touch of his hand. When she opened them again, Adrian was looking at her with an intensity that took her breath away. "I don't know what the future holds for us," she said, "but I know I want to face it by your side." Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin, in the space that separated their bodies, a perfect calm was born. When Adrian leaned down to kiss her, Eleanor felt that all the broken pieces of her life finally found their place. March arrived with rains that melted the snow, revealing a damp soil where the first green shoots were already appearing. The forest was awakening from its winter lethargy, and with it something new was blooming between Elena and Adrian. They hadn't put names to what they felt, hadn't made formal promises. They didn't need them. Their hands naturally sought each other when they walked through the forest. Their bodies found their way to each other during cold nights. Their silences, always comfortable, were now impregnated with an intimacy that made many words unnecessary. One morning, while collecting maple sap, Adrian stopped, observing the horizon with a worried expression. "We must go to the village," he said, surprising Elena. "We need provisions we can't get here." Elena felt her stomach contract with apprehension. She hadn't left the forest since her arrival, almost 6 months ago. The village meant people, questions, the risk of being recognized. "Is it necessary for me to go?" she asked, not hiding her concern. Adrian came closer, taking her hands in his. "I won't force you," he said gently. "But you can't hide forever, Elena. Not if you want to build a life here." Elena knew he was right. The forest had been her sanctuary, but it couldn't become her prison. If she truly wanted the freedom she had sought when fleeing, she had to face her fears. "I'll go with you," she finally decided. "But I'll need something more than these rags to wear." Adrian smiled, one of those rare smiles that transformed his face, softening the hard lines that pain had carved. "I have something that might serve you," he said, and in his eyes shone a secret. That afternoon, Adrian took from the old trunk a simple blue wool dress, worn but clean, and a shawl woven with geometric motifs. "They were my mother's," he explained, with a note of reverence in his voice. "I kept them, though I don't know why." Elena took the garments carefully, moved by the gesture. That Adrian would share with her something so personal, so linked to his past, meant more than any declaration of affection. The next day they departed at dawn, when the forest was wrapped in a silver mist that blurred the outlines of the trees. Elena rode Adrian's mare, while he walked beside her holding the reins. The blue dress was somewhat large on her, but the shawl protected her from the morning cold. As they moved away from the forest, Elena felt her anxiety growing. What if someone recognized her? What if her father had extended the search to this remote village? As if reading her thoughts, Adrian spoke without looking at her. "No one will harm you while I'm with you," he said with a calmness that contrasted with the implicit strength in his words. "And if they recognize you, we'll face whatever comes, together." The village of Robledal was small, just a few dozen houses around a square where a stone church stood. People looked at them with curiosity as they advanced toward the general store. Eleanor kept her head down, the shawl partially covering her face. Inside the store, Adrian exchanged furs for flour, coffee, sugar, and other provisions. The shopkeeper, an older man with shrewd eyes, observed Elena with interest. "It's not common to see you accompanied, Montero," he commented while weighing the flour. "Your sister?" "My wife," Adrian responded without hesitation. Elena held her breath, surprised by the lie, though she immediately understood its purpose. A single woman living with a man in the forest would be the subject of gossip. A wife, on the other hand, was respectable. The shopkeeper nodded, accepting the explanation without further questions. While they waited for their order to be prepared, Elena walked along the shelves, marveling at objects she once considered every day, and that now seemed strangely foreign. She stopped before a small mirror, surprised by her own reflection. The pale, frightened young woman who had fled from her wedding had disappeared. In her place, a woman with rosy cheeks and a firm gaze looked back at her. Her hair, once carefully styled, now fell in free waves around her face. Her hands, once soft, showed calluses she was strangely proud of. "I didn't recognize you," said a voice behind her. Elena turned, alarmed. An older woman with grey hair gathered in a severe bun observed her with penetrating eyes. "Excuse me, but I think you're confusing me with someone else," Elena responded, trying to maintain her calm. The woman shook her head. "I saw you once in the Vidal house. You were barely a child, but you have your mother's eyes," she said in a low voice. "They say you fled from your wedding." Elena felt the ground moving beneath her feet. Would this woman betray her? Would she spread the word that the lost Vidal daughter was in Robledal? To her surprise, the woman smiled slightly. "Your mother would have been proud," she said before moving away among the shelves. When they left the store loaded with provisions, Elena was still shaking. She told Adrian about the encounter as they returned to the forest. "Do you think she'll say something?" she asked, looking nervously behind her. Adrian reflected a moment before answering. "If she had wanted to cause you problems, she would have done so right there," he finally said. "But we must be cautious. News travels fast." That night, back in the cabin, while they stored the provisions, Elena found among the packages something she didn't remember buying. Seeds. Small paper envelopes, marked with names that promised life: tomatoes, carrots, poppies. "When?" she began to ask. "While you were talking with that woman," Adrian responded with an expression Elena couldn't interpret. "I thought perhaps you'd want to plant a garden, make this place something more permanent." Elena felt something expanding in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the fireplace. "Your wife?" she asked, remembering Adrian's words in the store. He looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. It was the simplest explanation. Elena approached until she stood before him. What if it wasn't just an explanation, she asked, her heart beating so hard she feared he could hear it. Adrian looked at her then, and in his amber eyes Elena saw the reflection of her own longing. "Elena, I have nothing to offer you except this simple life, this forest, these hands that try to build something good after so much pain." She took those hands that had healed her wounds, that had taught her to survive, that every night held her as if she was something precious. "It's all I've chosen," she responded. "It's all I want." Under the roof of the cabin they had turned into a home, with the sound of the forest as the only witness. They sealed a promise that needed no words or ceremonies to be true. April spread, a mantle of wildflowers over the clearing surrounding the cabin. Eleanor, following the instructions of an old botany book that Adrian had gotten in the village, prepared the ground for her garden. Her hands, which once had only known delicate tasks, now sank into the earth with familiarity, feeling its texture, its promise. Adrian sometimes observed her from a distance while he repaired the shed roof or cut firewood. In those moments, when she didn't know she was being watched, he allowed himself to contemplate the miracle her presence represented. How this woman, born in abundance, had adapted to the austerity of the forest. How her hands, educated to play the piano in elegant salons, now cultivated the earth with the same dedication. One afternoon, while Elena was planting poppy seeds, near the entrance of the cabin, Adrian approached with something wrapped in a piece of cloth. "I found this in the village," he said, extending the package to her. "I thought you might like it." Elena wiped her hands on her apron before taking it. As she unwrapped it, she discovered a small blank notebook with a leather cover engraved, with floral motifs. "It's beautiful," she murmured, passing her fingers over the relief. "For you to write your story," Adrian explained. "The real one, not the one others wanted to write for you." Eleanor felt her eyes filling with tears. It was a perfect gift, not for its material value, but for what it symbolized. Adrian understood her need to reinvent herself, to reclaim her own narrative. That night, by the light of the oil lamp, Eleanor began to write. Not about her past, but about her present, about the forest that had become her refuge, about the plants she was learning to cultivate, about the silent man who had taught her that true freedom wasn't in fleeing, but in choosing. May brought gentle rains that made the seeds sprout. Elena's garden began to show the first signs of life, small green stems making their way toward the sun. Each morning she knelt beside them, marveling at the miracle of creation. It was during one of those mornings when she saw the riders, 3 men on horseback, advancing along the path that led to the cabin. One of them, the one riding in front, was painfully familiar to her even from a distance. "Adrian," she called, her voice tense with fear. He emerged from the cabin, immediately understanding the situation. Without a word, He took the rifle he always kept nearby and positioned himself in front of Elena. "Go inside," he told her, without taking his eyes off the riders. "No," she responded, standing up. "This is my battle. I won't put you in danger." The riders stopped a few meters from the cabin. Mateo Barrios, the man Elena was supposed to have married, dismounted with a fluid movement. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been considered attractive if not for the coldness of his grey eyes. "Elena," he said, in a voice that tried to sound kind, but that failed to hide his irritation. "Your father has been very worried." Elena took a step forward, aware of her appearance. She was no longer the refined young woman who had fled from her wedding. Her hands were stained with earth. Her simple dress contrasted with Mateo's elegant suit. Her hair, carelessly gathered, let rebellious strands escape. "My father is only concerned about his reputation," she responded calmly. "And you, Mateo, are only concerned about your wounded pride." Mateo narrowed his eyes, abandoning all pretense of kindness. "We made a deal, Elena. Your father and I." "A deal that sealed the future of both families." His gaze shifted toward Adrian. "And you've ruined it all for this? For a savage who lives in the forest like an animal?" Adrian remained impassive, the rifle steady in his hands, but Elena could feel the tension emanating from him. "I didn't ruin anything," she responded, with a voice that sounded stronger than she felt. "I saved my life, the life that belongs to me, not the one you decided for me." Mateo took a step toward her, and Adrian slightly raised the rifle, a silent warning. "Your place is in society, Elena," Mateo insisted, "with people of your class. You can't hide forever in this hole." "I'm not hiding," she responded. "For the first time, I'm living. I breathe air that isn't poisoned by lies and appearances. My hands create instead of simply adorning, and I love—" Her voice broke for an instant, but she recovered. "I love someone who sees me as a person, not as a possession." A tense silence followed her words. Mateo looked at her as if he didn't recognize her, and perhaps he truly didn't. The Elena he knew, the one who had been promised to him, was barely a ghost, a construction imposed by others' expectations. "Your father has disowned you," Mateo finally said coldly. "He has announced he has no daughter. Did you know that? You have nothing, Elena. No name, no fortune, no future." Elena felt the impact of those words, but not in the way Mateo expected. Instead of fear, what invaded her was a strange sense of liberation. "Then I am free," she responded, with a smile that disconcerted Mateo. "Free to build my own name, my own fortune, my own future." Adrian took a step forward, positioning himself beside her. He said nothing, but his presence, solid and firm like the trees surrounding them, communicated all that was necessary. Mateo looked at them both with contempt, but something in his expression had changed. It was no longer the arrogant confidence of someone who expects to recover what they consider theirs. It was the frustration of someone who understands they've lost something they never really possessed. "You'll come crawling back when this rustic dream turns into a nightmare," he said, turning back toward his horse. "And then you'll discover that the doors you've closed won't open again." Elena didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. She watched as Mateo mounted again, how the three riders turned and disappeared down the path. Only when the sound of hooves vanished in the distance did Elena feel her legs weakening. Adrian held her before she fell, his arms enveloping her, with a strength that didn't suffocate but supported. "Are you all right?" he asked, with evident concern in his voice. Elena nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The adrenaline of the confrontation was leaving her exhausted but strangely at peace. "My father has disowned me," she finally said, contemplating the garden she had begun to plant. "I'm no longer a Vidal." Adrian looked at her intently. "You're Elena," he said simply. "It's enough." And in that moment, under the open sky of May, surrounded by the first flowers of her garden, Elena understood that Adrian was right. It was enough. More than enough. Here it arrived with an explosion of color and life. Eleanor's garden thrived, offering not only beauty but also food. The poppies she had planted near the entrance of the cabin bloomed in an intense red that reminded her of the silver brooch that had been her only link to the past. The news that the disowned daughter of the Vidals lived in the forest with Adrian Montero had spread throughout the region, but contrary to her fears, it didn't bring persecution or harassment. On the contrary, one June afternoon, a woman from the village arrived at the cabin with her small son, who was burning with fever. "They say you know medicinal herbs," the woman said, her face marked with worry. "The doctor is away, and my Tomas, she isn't getting better." Elena, surprised by the request, led the woman inside the cabin. She examined the boy, remembering all that Adrian had taught her about healing plants. She prepared an herbal infusion to lower the fever and a poultice for the congested chest. "Stay tonight," she offered, seeing the woman was exhausted. "The return journey is long and your son needs to rest." The woman, who introduced herself as Marta, accepted gratefully. While the boy slept, they shared a simple dinner. Elena observed how Adrian, generally reserved with strangers, patiently responded to Marta's questions about life in the forest. The next morning, Tomas's fever had dropped. Marta, with tears in her eyes, tried to pay Elena with the few coins she carried. "I can't accept it," Elena said, closing Marta's hand over the coins. "I didn't help your son for money." "Then let me repay you in another way," Marta insisted. "I have chickens, I can bring you eggs every week." Thus began an exchange that soon extended. Other women from the village started seeking Elena for consultations about medicinal herbs, bringing in exchange food, fabrics, objects that made life in the cabin easier. Children sometimes came, fascinated by the stories Elena told them while gathering plants in the forest. One afternoon, while returning from fetching water at the stream, Elena found Adrian sitting on the porch carving a piece of wood. She stopped a moment, observing him without him noticing. His hands, strong and calloused, worked the wood with surprising delicacy. His face, concentrated on the task, showed a serenity that contrasted with the severity he usually projected. "What are you making?" she asked, approaching. Adrian looked up, and his eyes lit up in a way that made Elena's heart skip. "A gift," he responded, showing her a small, almost finished figure. A poppy carved in cherry wood with details so precise it seemed about to move with the breeze. "It's beautiful," Elena murmured, taking the figure in her hands. "How did you learn to do this?" "My father was a carpenter," Adrian explained. "He taught me before he died, but it had been years since I carved anything, until you came." Elena understood the deep meaning of those words. Adrian wasn't just giving her a carved flower. He was showing her a part of himself that had remained dormant, buried under the weight of his pain. That night, as Elena placed the wooden poppy next to her silver brooch on the mantel above the fireplace, she felt that something was being completed. The symbol she had brought from her previous life now found an echo in a new symbol, created by the hands of the man she loved. July was advancing when Elena began to notice changes in her body. A fatigue different from that of physical work, morning sickness, a new sensitivity. At first she tried to ignore the signs, fearful of what they might mean. But one morning, while helping a woman from the village with her childbirth, the midwife looked at her with knowing eyes. "You carry life within you," she told her when they were alone. "Did you know?" Eleanor felt the world stopping for an instant. A child of Adrian and hers, conceived in the love they had built in their forest refuge. "How can you be sure?" she asked with a trembling voice. The midwife smiled. "I've brought more children into the world than I can count, girl. I recognize the signs." That night, when she returned to the cabin, Elena found Adrian waiting for her with concern. "Are you gone longer than usual?" he said, helping her dismount from the mare. "Is everything all right?" Eleanor took his hands, guiding them to rest on her belly. She didn't need words. She saw understanding illuminating Adrian's face, how his amber eyes widened with amazement. "Are you—" he began, unable to finish the question. Elena nodded, with tears of happiness sliding down her cheeks. "We're going to have a child, Adrian." What happened next surprised Elena. Adrian, always contained, always measured in his reactions, lifted her in his arms and spun with her, laughing as she had never heard him laugh. It was a new sound, liberated, as if something deeply buried finally found its way to the light. When he set her down, his eyes shone with unshed tears. I thought my lineage would end with me, he said in a husky voice, that the life I couldn't save would be the end of our story. Elena took his face in her hands. It's a new beginning, she said softly, for both of us. That night, as they lay together in the bed they had shared since winter, Adrian rested, his hand on Elena's still flat belly. There were no words to express what he felt, but they weren't necessary. The silence between them, as always, was full of meaning. Elena's pregnancy became visible with the arrival of August. Her belly rounded beneath the dresses she now made with fabrics that women from the village brought her in exchange for her knowledge of herbs. Her skin glowed with a new vitality, and her hair, longer and thicker, fell in dark waves over her shoulders. Adrian observed her with a mixture of fascination and concern. At night, when he thought she was asleep, he would rest his hand on her belly, as if trying to protect the life growing there from dangers only he perceived. One afternoon, while Eleanor was harvesting tomatoes in the garden, she saw Marta approaching with a worried expression. "Men have come to the village," she said without preamble. "They're asking about you and Adrian." Elena felt a chill run down her spine despite the summer heat. "What kind of men?" she asked, trying to maintain her calm. "They say they're sent." "By your father," Marta responded. "But they don't have an official appearance. They seem more like—" She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Mercenaries." Elena thanked her for the warning and, when Marta left, sought out Adrian, who was repairing the shed roof. She told him what she had heard, watching how his face hardened. "Your father hasn't accepted your decision," Adrian said, climbing down from the ladder, "despite having publicly disowned you." "Or perhaps it's Matteo who sent them," Elena suggested. "His wounded pride won't have healed so easily?" That night, as they dined in silence, they heard horses' hooves approaching. Adrian immediately took the rifle, indicating to Elena to stay away from the window. "Montero," called a voice from outside. "We know you're in there, and we know you have the Vidal girl with you." Elena approached Adrian, placing a hand on his arm that held the rifle. "Don't open," she whispered. "Don't give them what they're looking for." Adrian looked at her, and Elena saw in his eyes a determination she knew well. "I won't hand you over," he said firmly. "Neither you nor our child, see." Outside voice resonated again. "Don Ernesto Vidal offers a generous reward for his daughter. No one has to get hurt." Elena felt rage replacing fear. Her father, who had publicly disowned her, now treated her like lost property that needed to be recovered. "Let me speak to them," she said with a calmness that surprised Adrian. "It's dangerous," he protested. "We don't know what orders they have." "They can't force me to leave," Eleanor responded. "Not physically, not in my condition. Even men like those would have scruples against forcing a pregnant woman." Adrian hesitated, but finally nodded. Together, they approached the door. He opened it slowly, keeping Elena partially protected behind his body, the rifle ready but not directly pointed. 4 mounted men waited in the clearing in front of the cabin. In the moonlight, Elena could see they carried weapons but didn't openly brandish them. "Miss Vidal is not kidnapped," Adrian said in a firm voice. "She is here of her own will." The one who seemed to be the leader, a middle-aged man with scars, on his face spat on the ground. "That's not what we were told," he responded. "We were told you lured her away from her path, that you tricked her into abandoning her betrothed." Eleanor stepped forward, revealing her figure. The light from the lamp she held illuminated her face and her rounded belly. She saw how the men exchanged surprised looks. "As you can see, gentlemen," she said in a clear and firm voice, "my situation is delicate. I have built a new life here, away from impositions and forced marriages. I am expecting a child with the man I freely love. If my father truly cared about me, he wouldn't send armed men to look for me." The leader observed her with an uncomfortable expression. "Miss, we have orders." "Your orders were based on lies," Eleanor interrupted him. "You've been told I'm a captive, but the truth is, I'm more free here than I ever was in my father's house. You've been told you must rescue me, but all I need is for you to respect my decision." A tense silence followed her words. The men seemed disconcerted, as if the situation had taken a turn they hadn't anticipated. "Don." "Ernesto didn't mention a pregnancy," one of them murmured. "Of course not," Elena responded bitterly. For him, I'm still a possession, not a person capable of creating a new life. The leader seemed to reflect for a moment before speaking again. Our pay depends on bringing you back, miss, he finally said. But we're not monsters. We wouldn't drag a pregnant woman against her will. Then take a message to my father, Elena proposed. Tell him I'm well, that I'm happy, that I'm expecting a child, and tell him that if he ever wants to know his grandchild, he'll have to accept the life I've chosen. The men looked at each other, clearly unsure how to proceed. Finally, the leader nodded. We'll deliver your message, he said, though his tone suggested he doubted it would be well received. But I can't promise it will be the end of the matter. When the riders moved away, Eleanor felt her legs weakening. Adrian supported her, guiding her back inside the cabin. They sat by the fire, the silence between them charged with unexpressed thoughts. They won't give up so easily, Adrian finally said, his gaze fixed on the flames. I know, Elena responded, placing a hand on her belly. But now we have something more important to protect than just our freedom. Adrian looked at her then, and Elena saw in his eyes a silent oath. I'll build a life for us, where no one can reach us, he said in a soft but firm voice. A home so strong that not even the memory of the past can penetrate it. Eleanor rested her head on Adrian's shoulder, finding comfort in his solidity, in his constant presence. Outside, the forest whispered ancient secrets, promises of protection that had sustained generations of wild creatures. And inside her, a new life grew, oblivious to the battles being fought for its future. September arrived with winds that announced the change of season. The leaves were beginning to tinge with gold and crimson, and the mornings dawned covered with a silver mist that slowly dissipated with the first rays of the sun. Elena, now in her 5th month of pregnancy, felt how the life within her strengthened day by day. Sometimes, when she was still, she could feel gentle movements like butterfly flutters that filled her with an indescribable joy. Adrian had become more protective, though he tried not to smother her. He had begun to build a cradle with his own hands, carefully selecting the wood, working on it during the afternoons while Eleanor sewed small garments for the baby. The cabin, which was already a home, now prepared to receive a new life. The dried herbs hanging from the beams weren't just for curing ailments but also for welcoming. Rosemary for protection, lavender for peaceful sleep, chamomile to soothe colic. One morning, while Eleanor was gathering the last apples from the small orchard, she saw a carriage approaching on the path. It wasn't an ostentatious vehicle, but it didn't belong to the simple people of the village either. Her heart accelerated, fearing it might be her father or Matteo who came in it. Adrian, who was working nearby, immediately left his tools and positioned himself beside her, his posture tense but controlled. The carriage stopped a few meters from the cabin. The door opened, and to Elena's surprise, an older woman descended, elegantly dressed but without ostentation. It took her a moment to recognize her. It was Doña Sofia, Matteo Barrios's mother. I wasn't expecting visitors, Adrian said, his voice neutral but vigilant. Doña Sofia advanced with measured steps, leaning on a cane with a silver handle. Her eyes, the same grey as her son's but without his coldness, settled on Elena. I've come alone, she said, as if that explained her presence. My son doesn't know I'm here. Elena took a step forward, intrigued by this unexpected visit. To what do I owe the honor, Doña Sofia? She asked, without hostility, but with caution. The woman observed Elena's rounded belly, and an expression momentarily softened her features. I've come to bring you something that belongs to you, she responded, gesturing to the coachman who waited by the carriage. The man approached, carrying a small but evidently heavy trunk. He left it on the ground in front of Eleanor. These are some of your belongings, Doña Sofia explained. Books, clothes, personal objects. Your father ordered them burned when he disowned you, but I kept them. I thought someday you might need them. Elena looked at the trunk with a mixture of contradictory emotions. On one hand, she felt curiosity about what it contained, about those parts of her previous life she had left behind. On the other, she feared these objects might bring memories she had tried to bury. Why are you doing this? She asked, looking directly at Doña Sofia. Your son hates me. My father has disowned me. The woman gave a sad smile. My son doesn't hate you, Elena. His pride is wounded, it's true, but I always knew that marriage was a mistake. She paused, leaning more heavily on her cane. As for your father, well, men like him and my late husband believe they can control everything, even the hearts of those they supposedly love. Elena felt something loosening in her chest, a tension she had carried without realizing. Thank you, she said simply, for saving these things, for coming all the way here. Doña Sofia nodded, and then looked at Adrian, who had maintained a prudent but alert distance. Take care of her, she said, not as an order but as a request. There are few treasures in this world more valuable than a woman who knows her own heart. Adrian held her gaze a moment before nodding once, a gesture that contained a firmer promise than any word. When the carriage moved away, Elena and Adrian remained facing the trunk, as if it were a strange creature that had appeared in their territory. Do you want to open it? Adrian asked, observing her undecided expression. Elena breathed deeply before responding. Yes, she finally said, it's part of my history, and I want our child to know the whole truth someday, not just fragments. Together they carried the trunk inside the cabin. Elena knelt in front of it, feeling the weight of expectations, of memories that awaited inside. Upon opening it, the first things she saw were her favorite books, volumes of poetry, novels she had read in secret, botany, treatises her mother had given her. Underneath were carefully folded dresses, not the ostentatious ones her father forced her to wear, but the simpler ones she preferred for her moments of solitude. And at the bottom, wrapped in a silk handkerchief, she found something that took her breath away, a miniature portrait of her mother, painted when she was young, before life with Ernesto Vidal extinguished the light in her eyes. She was beautiful, Adrian said, looking over her shoulder. You look like her. Elena nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. She held the portrait delicately, as if afraid it might vanish between her fingers. I always believed this portrait was lost, she finally murmured. My father made it disappear after her death, said it caused him too much pain to see it. Perhaps it was Doña Sofia who saved this too, Adrian suggested. Elena contemplated the image a moment longer before placing it on the mantel of the fireplace, next to the wooden poppy carved by Adrian and the silver brooch. 3 generations, she said with a smile that mixed melancholy and hope. My mother, me, and the child growing inside me. That night, as rain gently tapped on the cabin roof, Elena wrote in the notebook Adrian had given her, not about the past, as she had feared Doña Sofia's visit would compel her to do, but about the future, about the child who would be born when winter began to give way to spring, about the stories she would tell, the songs she would sing, the values she would teach. Adrian watched her from his place by the fire, where he polished the final details of the cradle. His hands, strong but gentle, worked the wood with the same dedication with which they had built this home, with which they had held Elena in her moments of doubt. What are you thinking about? Elena asked, looking up from her notebook. Adrian looked at her, and his amber eyes shone with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. That I never imagined I could be so happy, he responded with simplicity. That the pain I thought would define me forever now seems a distant memory. Elena closed her notebook and approached him, sitting by his side. She took one of his hands, intertwining her fingers with his. Our child will be born in a home built with love, she said softly. Not with obligations, not with expectations, but with freedom to be whoever they want to be. Adrian rested his other hand on Elena's belly, feeling how the life they had created together moved under his palm. Like you, he said with a voice charged with emotion, free and brave. Outside, the rain continued its song against the roof, a constant rhythm that promised fertility and renewal. The forest, always vigilant, enveloped them in its protective embrace. And inside the cabin, in the warm space they had created, the past was no longer a threat but simply a path that had led them here, to this perfect moment in its imperfection. October painted the forest with copper and golden hues, while the wind tore leaves from the trees in a slow dance that covered the ground with a crunching carpet. Eleanor, whose belly now curved prominently beneath her dresses, spent the afternoons preparing the cabin for the approaching winter. She had learned to use every resource. Late apples became preserves. Nuts were stored in burlap sacks. Medicinal herbs were dried in bunches that hung from the beams. Her hands, which once had only known silk gloves and delicate fans, now moved with the certainty of one who understands the direct relationship between work and survival. Adrian had finished the cradle, a work of art in cherry wood with carved details. Poppies that intertwined on the posts, small birds that seemed about to take flight on the headboard. He had placed it near the fireplace, where the heat would keep the baby protected from the rigors of winter. "It's perfect," Elena had said, passing her fingers over the polished wood. "Our child will sleep surrounded by beauty." One morning in late October, while Elena was harvesting the last pumpkins from the garden, she saw Marta approaching on the path. She carried a package wrapped in cloth and an expression that mixed joy and nervousness. "Good morning, Elena," she greeted, observing her belly with approval. "The baby grows strong, it shows." Elena smiled, instinctively placing a hand on her abdomen where the child moved vigorously. "Sometimes I think he's practicing to be a dancer," she joked. "He doesn't stay still even when I sleep." Marta nodded, understanding. "My Tomas was the same. He almost broke my ribs before deciding to be born." She unwrapped the package she carried. "I've brought you this. We made it among several women from the village. It was a quilt for the baby, made with patches of fabrics of different colors and textures, each piece carefully sewn by hand. In the center, embroidered with golden thread, was a poppy identical to Elena's brooch. "It's beautiful," Elena murmured, moved by the gesture. "How did they know?" "Adrian came to the village last week," Marta explained. "He showed us your brooch and asked that we include it in the design. He said it was important to you." Elena felt her eyes filling with tears. Adrian, who rarely spoke of feelings, had understood how much that symbol of her past meant to her and had found a way to incorporate it into their child's future. "There's something else," added Marta, lowering her voice though there was no one else to hear them. "Doña Sofia Barrios has been asking about you in the village. Not in a bad way," she hurried to clarify, seeing the alarm on Elena's face. "She asks how you are, if you need anything. She even left money with the apothecary to prepare remedies for when the time of childbirth comes." Elena felt a mixture of contradictory emotions. On one hand, gratitude toward this woman who seemed to watch over her from a distance. On the other, unease at the possibility that her interest might hide other intentions. "And my father?" she asked, fearing the answer. "Or Mateo, have they asked about me?" Marta shook her head. "Nothing has been heard from Don Ernesto since he publicly disowned you. As for Mateo Barrios," she hesitated a moment, "there are rumors he's engaged to the daughter of a coastal landowner. It seems he has moved on." Elena felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. If Mateo had really found another fiancé, perhaps he would finally leave her in peace. When Adrian returned from hunting, Elena showed him the quilt and told him about Doña Sofia's intervention. She watched him as he processed the information, his face moving from surprise to caution. "Do you trust her?" he finally asked, sitting across from Elena by the fire. "I don't know," she responded honestly, "but I believe she genuinely disapproves of the way her son and my father treated me. Perhaps she sees in me the woman she could never be." Adrian nodded slowly, as if the idea made sense to him. "Women like Doña Sofia were raised to obey, not to choose," he said, with an understanding that surprised Elena. "Perhaps she finds in your rebellion something she admires." That night, as the first frost covered the forest with a silver mantle, Elena lay beside Adrian, their bodies finding the position that accommodated her growing belly. In the darkness, she felt how he rested his hand on the place where their child gave insistent kicks. "Sometimes I'm afraid," Elena confessed in a whisper, "not of childbirth, but of what comes after, if I'll know how to be a good mother." Adrian held her more tightly, his warm breath against her neck. "Fear is natural," he responded gently. "It shows you understand the importance of what we're doing. But you're not alone, Elena. We'll learn together." "What if I make the same mistakes as my father?" she insisted, giving voice to a fear that stalked her in her most vulnerable moments. "What if, without realizing, I try to mold our child according to expectations that aren't theirs?" Adrian slightly sat up, seeking her gaze in the half-darkness illuminated only by the dying embers of the fire. "The simple fact that you worry about that shows you're different," he said with conviction. "Your father never questioned if his decisions were right for you. Your mother perhaps did, but didn't have the strength or opportunity to change things. You have both." Eleanor felt his words penetrating to the deepest part of her being, dissolving an anxiety that had been present since she discovered her pregnancy. "Do you know what name I'd like if it's a girl?" she asked, changing the subject but not the emotion. "Which?" Adrian responded, following her thought. "Amapola," Eleanor said with a smile in her voice. "Like my mother's brooch, like the flowers we planted together, like the carvings you made on the cradle." Adrian kissed her forehead with infinite tenderness. "It's perfect," he murmured, "a name that contains all our history." November advanced with leaden skies and winds that announced the first snowfall. Elena's belly had grown so much that she found it difficult to perform simple tasks. Adrian insisted she rest more, but she resisted inactivity. "The baby will be born in late January, according to the midwife," she reminded him. "Weeks still remain. I can't spend them sitting watching you work." However, on a particularly cold day, while Eleanor tried to hang dried herbs in the kitchen, she felt a sharp pain that made her double over. Adrian, who was entering at that moment loaded with firewood, dropped the logs and ran to her. "What's happening?" he asked, fear evident in his voice. Elena breathed deeply, waiting for the pain to pass. "It's nothing," she tried to reassure him. "Just a twinge. The midwife said they're normal in these months." But Adrian wasn't convinced. He insisted she lie down while he rode to the village to fetch the midwife. Eleanor protested, arguing it was unnecessary, but the firmness in Adrian's eyes finally convinced her. "I'll return before nightfall," he promised, kissing her briefly before leaving. Alone in the cabin, Eleanor listened as the wind increased in intensity, whistling among the trees like a wounded animal. She lay on the bed, with a hand on her belly, feeling the movements of the baby that now seemed softer, as if it too were resting. Without wanting to, her thoughts traveled to the future. She imagined her son or daughter growing up in this forest, learning to fish in the stream, to identify medicinal plants, to carve wood like Adrian. She imagined them free from the suffocating expectations that had marked her own childhood, able to choose their own path. "I promise you'll be free," she whispered to the life growing inside her. "Free to make your own mistakes, to find your own happiness. I won't chain you to a destiny you haven't chosen." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the world with a mantle of silence and purity. And inside the cabin, in the stillness of waiting, Eleanor understood that she had completed a cycle. She had fled from an imposed marriage in search of freedom, and now that same freedom was the most precious gift she could offer her child. The last day of January dawned with unusual clarity. The snow that had covered the forest for weeks reflected the light of the rising sun, creating an almost supernatural glow. Elena, whose belly seemed unable to expand further, observed the spectacle from the cabin window. The pains had begun the previous night, gentle at first, like distant waves gradually approaching the shore. The midwife, who had come to stay with them for the past 3 days, prepared herbal infusions and arranged clean cloths near the fire. Adrian moved around the cabin with contained energy, feeding the fire, carrying water, following the midwife's instructions with the same precision with which he executed every task in his life. But Elena could see the worry in his eyes, the fear he tried to hide behind his efficiency. "Come," she said, extending her hand to him. "Sit with me a moment." Adrian approached, taking her hand in his. The midwife, with the wisdom of one who has witnessed hundreds of births, discreetly went out to the porch, giving them a moment of privacy. "I'm so afraid," Adrian confessed, with a vulnerability he rarely showed. "Of not being enough, of failing you as I failed Javier." Elena squeezed his hand, moved by this confession that revealed the wound that, despite all they had lived through together, still hadn't completely healed. "You won't fail me," she said with serene certainty. "And you won't fail our child. The past doesn't determine the future, Adrian. You taught me that when you took me in that night, when you gave me the opportunity to build a new life, a more Intense pain interrupted her, making her clench her teeth. Adrian tensed, but Elena didn't release his hand. "It's part of the process," she said when she could speak again. "Our child is finding its way to us." The midwife returned, assessing the situation with expert eyes. "It's time to prepare," she announced, with the calm of one who has accompanied this miracle countless times. "The baby will come soon." The following hours transformed into a blur of pain and effort for Elena. Time lost its usual meaning, now marked by the rhythm of contractions that became more intense and frequent. Adrian didn't leave her side, holding her hand, cleaning the sweat from her forehead, whispering words of encouragement she barely registered, but that somehow gave her strength. When the sun began to descend, tinting the snow with golden and reddish hues, a baby's cry broke the silence of the cabin. A small but powerful sound, the purest affirmation of life Elena had ever heard. "A girl," announced the midwife, with a smile that softened her usually severe face. "Strong and perfect." She placed the baby on Elena's chest, a tiny creature with dark hair and rosy skin. The world seemed to stop as Elena contemplated this miracle her body had created, this new life that was part of her and Adrian, but also completely unique. "Amapola," she whispered, feeling tears sliding down her cheeks. "Our little Amapola." Adrian knelt beside the bed, his face a mixture of awe and reverence. He extended a trembling hand, touching with infinite delicacy his daughter's little head. "She's perfect," he murmured, his voice broken with emotion, "like her mother." The days that followed passed in a haze of exhaustion and happiness for Elena. Her body, which had performed the most extraordinary work, needed time to recover. Amapola, however, seemed full of vital energy, demanding attention with a cry that Adrian insisted sounded like music. One afternoon, while Elena nursed the child by the fire, she observed Adrian working on a new carving project. His hands, always precise, now seemed to move with special delicacy. "What are you making?" she asked, curious. Adrian looked up, and Elena saw in his eyes a gleam that before only appeared when he looked at her. Now that gleam had expanded, encompassing also the small creature in her arms. "An amulet for Amapola," he responded, showing her the small piece of wood. "A tree with deep roots, so she always remembers where she comes from, but also that she's free to grow in any direction." Elena felt her heart expanding with a love she could barely contain. This man, who had turned her temporary refuge into a permanent home, now built symbols of belonging for their daughter. His carving represented exactly what Elena wished for Amapola: identity and freedom, belonging and autonomy, deep roots, but branches that could extend toward the sky without restrictions. "It's the most beautiful gift," she said, her voice charged with emotion. "She'll always carry it with her." Spring arrived early that year, as if nature wanted to celebrate the new life that had come to the forest. The streams grew with the thaw, their constant murmur lulling Amapola during her naps on the porch. The first wildflowers dotted the clearing around the cabin, and among them, the poppies Elena had planted the previous year emerged strongly, their red petals like drops of vital blood against the renewed green. One April morning, while Elena hung freshly washed diapers on the lines beside the cabin, she saw a carriage approaching on the path. Her heart skipped a beat, remembering the last unexpected visit, but she calmed down upon recognizing Doña Sofia's vehicle. Adrian, who was working on an extension of the cabin to create a space dedicated to Elena's medicinal herbs, left his tools and approached her side. Amapola slept peacefully in a basket under the shade of a young oak. The carriage stopped, and Doña Sofia descended with the help of her cane. Despite her age and evident difficulty moving, there was something majestic in her bearing, a dignity. The years hadn't eroded. "I've come to meet the child," she said without preamble, her gaze seeking the basket where Amapola slept. "If you permit me." Elena and Adrian exchanged a glance. In silence, as had been their custom from the beginning, they reached an agreement. Elena nodded and led Doña Sofia to the basket. The old woman leaned over, observing the baby with an expression that mixed tenderness and melancholy. "She looks like you," she said to Elena. "She has your strength in her forehead, your determination in her chin." She paused. and then added in a low voice, "And she has her father's serenity in her eyes." Something in the way she pronounced those words made Elena understand that this wasn't just a courtesy visit. Doña Sofia had come to say goodbye. "Are you ill?" she asked gently, while Adrian discreetly returned to his work, giving them space. The old woman smiled with resignation. "The doctors say my heart is tired," she responded. "It's not a surprise. It has endured too many disappointments, too many forced silences." Her gaze was lost for a moment on the horizon before returning to Eleanor. "I wanted to see with my own eyes that you were well, that you had found what was denied to me." "What was it?" Elena asked, sensing there was a story behind that confession. Doña Sofia gently caressed Amapola's cheek before answering. "The freedom to choose," she said simply. "To love according to my heart, not according to my family's interests. When I was your age, I loved a man my father considered unworthy. A teacher, without fortune, but with a brilliant mind and generous soul. Her eyes filled with memories. They married me to Matteo's father, a man I never loved but learned to respect. He wasn't a bad husband, but my life was a long exercise in conformity." Eleanor felt a deep connection with this woman who, beneath her appearance of aristocratic rigidity, had harbored the same yearnings that had driven her to flee on a September night. "Is that why you helped me?" she asked. "Is that why you saved my belongings and now come to meet my daughter?" Doña Sofia nodded slowly. "When I learned you had fled, I felt that somehow you were living what I couldn't. And when I discovered you had found refuge with a man who respects you and loves you for who you are, I knew I had to protect your choice, even if from the shadows." Elena took the old woman's hands in hers, feeling their fragility, but also the inner strength that had survived decades of resignation. "Thank you," she said with all the sincerity of her heart, "for everything." Doña Sofia smiled, and for an instant Elena could see the young woman she had been, the one who had dreamed of a different life. "I've brought something for the child," she said, gesturing to her coachman who waited discreetly at a distance. The man approached with a package wrapped in fine cloth. Doña Sofia took it and unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small silver music box with elaborate engraving. "It was mine when I was a girl," she explained. "One of the few things I could choose to keep throughout the years. I'd like Amapola to have it, as a reminder that beauty can survive even in the most adverse circumstances." Eleanor accepted the gift, moved by its meaning. She opened the box, and a soft, almost ethereal melody emerged, filling the spring air with notes that seemed to come from another time. Amapola woke with the music, her small eyes opening to the world. She didn't cry as Elena expected. Instead, she seemed to listen with an attention that was almost comical in such a small creature. "She likes it," Elena said, surprised. "Usually she wakes up crying." Doña Sofia smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her usually austere face. "She has good taste," she commented, "like her mother." That afternoon, after Doña Sofia had left with the promise that Elena would write to tell her about Amapola's progress, Eleanor and Adrian sat on the porch. The child slept again, this time in her father's arms, who held her with a mixture of amazement and devotion that still hadn't diminished since her birth. "It's strange," Eleanor said, contemplating the forest blooming before them. "Less than 2 years ago I escaped from a life that had been imposed on me, not knowing where I was going. And now you've created a life that is completely yours," Adrian completed, his voice soft so as not to wake the baby. "A life you chose, step by step." Elena nodded, resting her head on Adrian's shoulder. "Sometimes I think about that night," she confessed, "about how my feet were bleeding, how fear drove me to keep running, and I wonder what would have become of me if the stream hadn't guided me to your cabin." Adrian was silent for a moment, his gaze lost on the horizon where the sun began to descend. "I think you would have found your way anyway," he finally said. "Perhaps differently, perhaps with more difficulties, but you would have found it. The strength that led you to flee that night wouldn't have settled for less." Elena contemplated her daughter, whose small face reflected a peace that contrasted with the turbulent circumstances of her conception. "I hope she never has to flee," she said quietly, "that she never knows the fear that drove me that night." "She won't," Adrian responded with conviction, Because we'll teach her to recognize her worth from the beginning, to defend her choices, to not settle for less than she deserves." He paused, and then added, "We'll teach her to be as brave as her mother." The sunset enveloped them in a golden light that transformed the clearing into an almost magical space. The shadows of the trees lengthened, projecting onto the cabin that was no longer a temporary refuge, but a home in the deepest sense of the word. "We should plant a tree for her," Elena suggested, following a tradition she had heard as a child. "An oak or a maple, something that grows strong and endures." Adrian nodded, his gaze scanning the clearing as if looking for the perfect spot. "We'll plant it there," he said, pointing to a space near the garden, where sunlight arrived generously during most of the day. "And each year on her birthday, we'll tell her the story of how she grew alongside her tree, putting down roots, but extending her branches toward the sky." Elena smiled, imagining Amapola in the years to come, learning to walk in this clearing, discovering the secrets of the forest, listening to the violin Adrian had restored for her, planting her own garden next to her mother's. "She will be free," she said, not as a hope but as a certainty, free to create her own story without anyone writing it for her in advance. The sun finally hid behind the mountains, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Inside, the cabin, the music box, remained on the mantel next to the poppy brooch, the portrait of Elena's mother, and the wooden carving Adrian had created for their daughter. Symbols of a past that wasn't denied, but no longer dictated the present, of a future that was built day by day with conscious decisions and acts of love. That night, while Amapola slept in her cradle carved with poppies and birds about to take flight, Elena wrote in her notebook. Not about the past, not even about the present, but about her hopes for the future, about the woman she wished Amapola would become, strong but compassionate, rooted but free, capable of recognizing her own worth without depending on others. Validation. Adrian approached silently, reading over her shoulder. He didn't interrupt, respecting as always her inner space, but when Elena finished writing, he gently placed a hand over hers. "She'll be all that and more," he said with certainty, "because she has your roots and my wings." Elena closed the notebook and turned to him. In his amber eyes, she saw reflected the same peace she had desperately sought that September night, when she ran barefoot through the forest fleeing from invisible chains. "And she'll have something neither of us had," she added, "the certainty of being loved exactly as she is." Outside, the spring wind whispered among the trees, carrying promises of renewal and growth. And inside the cabin that had once been just a temporary refuge, the small family that had formed against all odds rested in the certainty of having found, finally, the place where they belonged. Not a physical space, but the unlimited territory of freely chosen love, day after day.